Anthony Conti, and I'll be presenting the history of hats. I chose hats because no one has explored the impact of hats on society and on how people function today. In this video, you will learn what hats are, when the first hats were made, where hats came from, how hats affect society and how we live, who were the first peoples in the world to make hats, and why hats are so significant for us today. First of all, we must know what a hat is. A hat is a shaped covering for the head worn for warmth, as a fashion item, or as part of a uniform. Now I'll go through the 8 thresholds and how they relate to hats. The first threshold is the Big Bang. We do not know what caused the Big Bang or how it happened, but we do know it made all the matter in the universe that we know of. Threshold 2, stars lit up. Stars form inside relatively dense clouds of interstellar gas and dust, known as molecular clouds. Stars form when the denser part of the cloud core collapses on its own weight and gravity. This relates to hats because our sun and other stars emit ultraviolet waves, and that is responsible for causing sunburn. And sunburn drove humans to create hats and things to stop that from happening again. The next threshold, threshold 3, is new chemical elements. New chemical elements were formed when slight inequalities in the distribution of hydrogen and helium atoms allowed them to clump up and fuse together to make different elements. The next threshold, threshold 4, is our solar system and Earth. The solar system was made by clouds of matter spinning around and around our young sun, gradually forming just about everything in our solar system, from Jupiter to Uranus and to the Earth where we are today. Threshold 5 is early life. We don't know much about early life, like how it got here, but we do know during this period the first single-cell organisms came on this earth and it eventually evolved into us. The next threshold, threshold 6, is collective learning. Collective learning is the art of passing down technologies to younger generations. An example of this is we don't have to learn how to make a car again. But today, we do innovate on a car. The next threshold, threshold 7, is agriculture. During this time, a lot of civilizations were starting to use hats. In China, they were made out of straw or matting with a cloth shin strap because they were needed to be light for when they were farming. In ancient Nordic countries, since it was much cooler they could not farm, but they hunted. And they made the hats out of the fur of the animals they hunted. In ancient Greece and Rome, they were called Phrygian caps. That was made from a felt and cloth that was mostly used by escaped slaves. The next threshold, threshold 8, is the modern revolution. In the 18th century, the hat making industry really kicked off, and the name of a hat maker that is still used today is a milliner. In the early to late 1900s, the people that ran horse tracks and other fine establishments made it mandatory for the patrons there to either wear a top hat or hat like that. And finally, in the early 21st century, flamboyant hats made a comeback with a new wave of a competitive young milliners designing creations that included turban caps, fancy caps, and hats made of human hair, aka wigs. The next part here is questions for scientific figures that'll know a lot about hats. The first questions will be about archaeology. The first question will be, was there any painting / artworks about hats in ancient times? The answer is yes. In ancient times, there were artworks depicting kings with crowns on their heads. And also, there was paintings in ancient Egypt by the pharaohs with their magnificent golden hats on, and their tombs, the tombs of in ancient Egypt, their sarcophaguses, they had the golden hats chiseled in on them. So yes, it was an important thing in ancient times. The second question is, were hats used as a status symbol for the rich or upper class? And the answer is yes. Back in ancient times, there were golden crowns sitting upon the heads of European rulers. And even now, if you see someone with a Gucci hat, the brand, or Supreme hat, the brands show that the person is wealthy or rich. The next two questions are for a milliner. And a milliner is a person that creates and manufactures hats. The first question is, who was the first person / place in the world to produce hats en masse? The first ever mass making of hats is from the city of Milan in Italy. And a fun fact is, that is where the name milliner gets its name from. Second question is, who was the first ever really famous hat maker? And the first ever famous hat maker is Philip Anthony Tracy, born May 26, 1967, and is an award-winning milliner / hat designer, and many people have called him perhaps the greatest ever living milliner. The next topic the two questions will be on is chemistry. The first question is, what effect does UV rays have on us, and why are hats important to help us against them? UV rays causes skin cancer and many other diseases. So the hats absorb and block us from the UV rays, keeping our skin safe. That is why when you go to the beach, you will see a lot of people wearing hats. The second question is, has the chemical composition of hats ever changed drastically? And the answer is yes. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was mercury that was used in hats that made people insane because it affected the brain cells. That is where the common conception of mad as a hatter came from, is because if you wore a hat that had mercury in it for too long, your brain got affected by it. Final stretch of this video will be about all the things we learned in the class and 5 different objectives we learned about. And I'll tie that in about hats. One thing that we learned about is the ozone layer. The ozone layer is a ring of protective gases around the Earth that absorbs harmful UV rays before they reach the surface. The ozone layer and the hat have the same uses. They protect us from the sun. So the ozone layer is like a giant hat for the Earth. The next subject we learned about in the Big History Project is complexity. Hats take a lot of time and parts to make. So hats are complex because you need all the fabric, all the coloring and dyes, and finally the sewing to put it finally all together. One other thing that we learned in the Big History Project is simplicity. And hats are very simple at the same time as being complex. Because when you get to the base root of it, anything on top of your head could be considered a hat. If I stapled a book to my head, would that book not be a hat? And we also learned many things in the universe are simple, but only a couple are complex. And then you get this weird paradox of things like a hat that are somehow both. One other thing we learned in the Big History Project is collective learning. Collective learning is passing down knowledge to other generations. And one thing that was passed down to us are hats. No one now is learning how to make a simple hat. or what a hat is. But back in 1000 BC, they didn't know. And all hats evolved differently and separately from each other. So hats are a great example of collective learning. One last thing that we learn in the Big History Project is different scales. This relates to hats because on the surface, it's only something that's on your head. It could be anything. But when you get down to the nitty-gritty of it, hats protect us from cancer and save lives each and every day. It shows if you're rich or poor or not. It's something built into our society, so ingrained, we sometimes forget they're even there. They're just on your head. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and learned something new from it. This has been Anthony Conti with the Big History of Hats.